The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's diner like bullets against glass, each drop carrying the weight of another lonely October evening in Millbrook, Ohio. Inside the warm glow of the corner booth, David Hayes sat with his calloused hands folded around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at 2 plates of pot roast and mashed potatoes. One plate sat directly in front of him, untouched. The other waited across the table in the seat that had remained empty for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. David was 38, though the lines around his blue eyes and the premature grey threading through his brown hair made him look older. His flannel shirt was clean but worn, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms marked by years of working under car hoods at Hayes Auto Repair. His hands told stories of rebuilt engines and scraped knuckles, but tonight they simply rested motionless on the scratched Formica table, as still as everything else in his life had become. The little red backpack still hung on the edge of the booth where Jake used to sit. Its fabric faded from 3 years of Friday night dinners. Jake Hayes had been 8 years old when the drunk driver ran the red light, slamming into the school bus with enough force to steal 3 innocent lives and shatter countless others. David's son had loved these Friday dinners at Murphy's, always ordering extra gravy and making elaborate plans for weekend adventures that would never come. Murphy's diner hadn't changed much since 1962, and that's exactly how the regulars liked it. Checkered linoleum floors stretched between red vinyl booths, while a vintage Wurlitzer jukebox played Patsy Cline and Johnny Cash for anyone willing to feed it quarters. The air was thick with the comforting aroma of apple pie cooling on windowsills, and coffee that had been brewing since dawn. Framed photographs of Millbrook's high school football teams decorated the walls, chronicling decades of small-town Friday night glory. Dolores Patterson had been waiting tables here for 27 years, and she'd learned to read her customers like well-worn menus. The 65-year-old grandmother with silver hair and knowing eyes had stopped asking David if someone was joining him after the first month. She'd simply bring 2 plates of pot roast, set them down without a word, and leave him to his grief. Some rituals were too sacred to disturb, even when they broke your heart to witness. Tonight felt heavier than usual. The 3rd anniversary was approaching, and David had spent the afternoon at the cemetery, sitting beside Jake's headstone and trying to remember the sound of his son's laughter. The memories were fading despite his desperate attempts to hold on to them, and that terrified him more than anything else. Jake had been everything to David after his wife left when the boy was only 3, claiming she wasn't cut out for motherhood or small-town life. David reached across the table and touched the strap of Jake's backpack, feeling the worn fabric beneath his fingertips. His son had been so proud of that backpack, decorated with dinosaur patches and filled with baseball cards, Pokemon figures, and the endless treasures that 8-year-olds considered priceless. The last conversation they'd had was about baseball practice, about whether David could make it to Saturday's game. He'd promised he would be there, cheering from the bleachers like always. The diner buzzed quietly around him with the comfortable murmur of Friday evening conversation. Couples shared dessert, families celebrated small victories, teenagers plotted weekend adventures. Life continued its relentless march forward, but David remained frozen in this booth, in this moment, ordering the same meal for a boy who would never grow older than 8. Before we continue, please tell us, where in the world are you tuning in from? We love seeing how far our stories travel. Outside, the October storm showed no signs of letting up, battering the small town with sheets of rain that turned Main Street into a river of reflected neon. David watched the water streak down the window and wondered not for the first time if this weekly pilgrimage was healing or just another form of self-punishment. But then he'd look at that empty seat at Jake's backpack, hanging there like a promise, and know he couldn't stop coming. This was the only hour of the week when his son still felt real, when the crushing weight of loss lifted just enough to let him breathe. Tonight, as the storm raged outside and time moved like molasses around his booth, David Hayes had no idea that everything was about to change. The diner door opened with its familiar chime, bringing a gust of cold air and the sound of rain against concrete. David barely glanced up from his untouched plate until he heard the voice small and shaking with desperation. "Excuse me, my son is hungry. Can we stay here a while?" A young woman stood just inside the doorway, water dripping from her oversized coat onto the checkered floor. She was thin, too, thin with blonde hair escaping from a messy bun and pale skin that suggested too many sleepless nights. Her jeans were worn through at the knees, and her sneakers had seen better days. Behind her legs, a small boy peered out with wide green eyes, clutching a worn teddy bear against his chest. The child couldn't have been more than 6 years old, with sandy brown hair that needed cutting and clothes that hung loose on his small frame. His jacket was too big, probably bought from a thrift store, with the hope he'd grow into it, and his shoes had holes that let in the rain. But it was his eyes that stopped David's heart. Eyes that held a mixture of fear and hunger that no child should ever have to carry. Dolores approached them with the measured steps of someone who'd seen too much of life's harsh realities. She dried her hands on her apron, her expression softening despite the business policy she was obligated to enforce. "Can I help you, hon?" she asked, not unkindly, but with the tone of someone who knew this conversation wasn't going to end well. The woman's voice was barely above a whisper, each word seeming to cost her something precious. "We're just wondering if it's okay if we sit down for a minute, just to get warm. We've been walking in the rain, and I thought, maybe—" She trailed off, looking down at her son, who had wrapped himself around her leg like a lifeline. The boy was shivering, whether from cold or fear, David couldn't tell. Dolores glanced around the diner, her weathered face creased with sympathy. "This is a restaurant, sweetie. I'm afraid if you want to sit, you need to order something." "I know, I understand," the woman said quickly, her hands trembling as she reached into her coat pocket. We don't have—" "I'm sorry. We'll go." The defeat in her voice hit David like a physical blow. He'd heard that tone before in his own voice during the dark months after Jake's death, when he'd lost the auto shop temporarily, and wasn't sure how he'd pay for the funeral. That sound of pride cracking under the weight of desperate circumstances. David watched the boy look up at his mother. And something in those green eyes, the way they held both trust and terror in equal measure, made his chest tighten. The child was probably the same age Jake had been when David's wife left, old enough to understand that something was very wrong, but too young to comprehend the full scope of their situation. He stood up before his mind could catch up with his heart. "They're with me," David said, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. Both Dolores and the woman turned to stare at him in surprise. David felt every eye in the restaurant focus on him as he gestured toward his booth, toward the empty seat across from his untouched dinner. "Come sit down," he said gently, meeting the woman's disbelieving gaze. The woman hesitated, her arms instinctively tightening around her son. "We can't. We don't want to bother anyone." "You're not bothering anyone," David said. And something about the way he looked at the boy with recognition rather than pity seemed to convince her. She guided her son toward the booth on unsteady legs, water still dripping from their clothes. The boy slid into the seat across from David, his eyes immediately drawn to the plate of food that had been waiting there. He stared at it like it was a mirage, like touching it might make it disappear. David pushed the plate toward him without hesitation. "Go ahead." The boy looked at his mother, seeking permission. She nodded, her hand trembling as she touched his shoulder, and he picked up the fork with fingers that shook from more than just the cold. He began eating with the desperate intensity of someone who wasn't sure when his next meal might come, stuffing mashed potatoes into his mouth like he was afraid someone might take the plate away. The woman wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks in what David now realized was more than just rainwater on her cheeks. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We'll pay you back. I promise we will. David shook his head, watching the boy eat. You don't owe me anything. Dolores appeared at the table without being called, setting down a glass of water for the boy and a cup of coffee for his mother. She met David's eyes for just a moment, something unreadable passing between them, then walked away without saying a word. In that look, David saw recognition, the understanding that some moments are too important for questions or explanations. The woman wrapped her fingers around the coffee cup like it was the first warmth she'd felt in days. For several minutes, nobody spoke. The boy ate with single-minded focus while his mother kept her head down, her shoulders shaking slightly with silent tears of relief or exhaustion, or both. David studied them, these strangers who had stumbled into his Friday night ritual, and felt something stir in his chest that wasn't the familiar ache of loss. When was the last time someone had needed him? Really needed him, the way this boy needed food and his mother needed hope. When the boy finally slowed down, his plate nearly clean, he looked up at David with eyes that were brighter now, less haunted. Thank you, he said quietly, his voice barely audible above the diner's background noise. David's throat tightened. The boy's voice carried the same gentle cadence that Jake's had the same polite uncertainty that came from being raised by a mother who'd taught him manners despite their circumstances. The woman reached across the table hesitantly, her hand hovering above David's before making contact. I'm Sarah, she said. Sarah Mitchell. And this is Tommy. David nodded, his voice thick when he responded. David Hayes? Sarah tried to smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. We're not usually like this. She trailed off, looking down at her hands, which David noticed bore the faint yellow traces of old bruises around the wrists. Things got difficult. She continued. We're trying to figure it out. David didn't ask for details. In the 3 years since Jake's death, he'd learned that some stories carried too much weight to be shared with strangers, no matter how kind their intentions. The bruises on Sarah's wrists told him enough. The careful way she positioned herself to keep an eye on both the door and the window spoke volumes about the life they'd been running from. Where are you staying? David asked instead. Though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sarah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. Where? We'll find somewhere. There's a shelter about an hour north of here. We just needed to wait for the rain to stop before we kept driving. That meant they were sleeping in their car if they even had one. David glanced at Tommy, who had finished eating and was now leaning against his mother's side, his eyes growing heavy with the kind of exhaustion that came from too many nights without real rest. The boy looked so small, sitting there drowning in clothes that didn't fit, clutching his teddy bear like it was the only constant in a world that had turned upside down. David thought about Jake at that age, how his son had trusted so completely in David's ability to keep him safe, to make everything okay when storms came or monsters hid in closets. How old are you, Tommy? David asked gently. The boy held up 6 fingers, then added in a whisper, I'll be 7 in December. Jake had been 7 when David had taught him to change a tire when they'd spent a whole Saturday in the shop learning about engines and tools and the satisfaction of fixing things with your hands. Jake had been so proud that day, running grease-stained fingers through his hair and declaring himself David's best mechanic. Do you like cars? David found himself asking. Tommy's eyes lit up slightly. I like big trucks, the ones with lots of wheels. 18-wheelers, David said. I work on those sometimes, motorcycles too. Really? For the first time, Tommy's voice carried a note of excitement instead of just fear. Sarah watched this exchange with something approaching wonder, as if she'd forgotten that adults could talk to her son without impatience or irritation. David noticed how she relaxed slightly when Tommy engaged, how her protective posture softened when she realized David posed no threat. Where are you folks from? David asked, though he was careful to keep his tone casual, non-threatening. Kentucky. Sarah said after a pause. Outside of Lexington. But we can't. We needed to leave. The way she said it, the careful editing of whatever story lay behind those words, told David everything he needed to know about why they were running. He'd seen enough domestic violence cases when he'd served on the volunteer fire department to recognize the signs, the way Sarah startled at sudden movements, how she positioned herself between Tommy and any potential threat, the practiced efficiency with which she'd assessed the diner's exits upon entering. I have a shop here in town, David said, making a decision that surprised him. Hayes Auto Repair. There's a small apartment above it, nothing fancy, but it's dry and warm. You could stay there tonight, just until you figure out your next step. Sarah's eyes went wide, and for a moment she looked like Tommy had when he'd seen the plate of food, like she couldn't quite believe what was being offered. We couldn't, she said automatically. We couldn't impose like that. It's not an imposition, David said firmly. It's just an empty room that could use some company. He thought about the apartment above the shop, how he'd intended it as guest quarters when he'd first bought the building 15 years ago. After his wife left, and it became just him and Jake, it had turned into storage space for Christmas decorations and outgrown clothes he couldn't bear to donate. After Jake died, David had simply closed the door and tried to forget the room existed. Tommy had fallen asleep against his mother's shoulder, his small face peaceful in a way that suggested this was the first time in days he'd felt safe enough to truly rest. Sarah stroked his hair with gentle fingers, her own eyes heavy with exhaustion. I don't understand, she said quietly. Why would you help us? You don't even know us. David looked at her, this young woman who was probably closer to Jake's age than his own, but who carried herself with the weight of someone who'd seen too much, survived too much. He thought about the conversations he'd had with his reflection in the bathroom mirror, the long nights when he'd wondered what the point was of continuing without Jake, the way he'd been going through the motions of living without actually being alive. Because someone should, he said finally, and because I know what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. He paid the bill while Sarah gathered their few belongings, her movements careful and quiet to avoid waking Tommy. Dolores handed him the receipt with a knowing look. You're doing a good thing, David, she said quietly. That woman's been hurt, and that little boy needs someone to show him what kindness looks like. David nodded, lifting Tommy gently from the booth. The boy weighed almost nothing, all sharp angles and fragile bones, but he settled against David's shoulder with the trust that only children possessed. Sarah followed them out into the rain, pulling her inadequate coat tighter against the cold. The drive to the shop took only 5 minutes through Millbrook's quiet streets, but David found himself taking the longer route past the town square, past the Methodist church where Jake had been baptized, past the elementary school where Tommy would probably need to enroll if they stayed. The rain had softened to a gentle mist that caught the streetlights like scattered diamonds. Hayes Auto Repair occupied a solid brick building on Oak Street with a metal garage door and a hand-painted sign that David's father had made decades ago. Inside, the familiar smells of motor oil and metal shavings welcomed them, along with the comforting presence of half-finished projects and tools organized with military precision. David led them through the shop, past the motorcycle he'd been rebuilding for months, past the workbench, where he'd taught Jake to sort screws and washers by size. The stairs to the apartment were narrow and steep, but they led to a surprisingly comfortable space with hardwood floors, large windows and furniture covered in dust sheets, like ghosts of a life once planned. It's not much, David said, setting Tommy down on the couch. The boy didn't wake up. Sarah stood in the doorway looking around the room as if she still couldn't believe this was happening. The apartment was simple but clean, with a kitchenette in one corner and a bedroom that David had optimistically furnished years ago. Sunlight would stream through the windows in the morning, and the radiator knocked with a rhythm that was somehow comforting rather than annoying. "Why are you doing this?" Sarah asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. David looked at Tommy, sleeping on the couch, at the way the boy's face had relaxed into something approaching peace, and thought about the empty apartment above the shop, the empty seat in the diner booth, the empty spaces that had defined his life for the past 3 years. Because maybe we all need saving, he said. Sarah stood motionless in the center of the apartment, her arms wrapped around herself as if she were still cold despite the warmth radiating from the old radiator. David watched her take in the space with the careful assessment of someone who'd learned not to trust sanctuary too quickly. Her eyes catalogued the exits, the sight lines to the street, the potential hiding places. It was a heartbreaking display of survival instincts that no mother should have to possess. "There are clean sheets in the bedroom closet," David said, quietly, not wanting to wake Tommy. "Towels in the bathroom. The heat should warm things up in about 20 minutes. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket and placed them on the kitchen counter. "These are for you. Front door of the shop back entrance and this apartment. Use them as long as you need to." Sarah stared at the keys like they were something foreign and incomprehensible. "I don't understand why you're trusting us. How do you know we're not dangerous? How do you know I won't steal from you or... Are you planning to?" David asked gently. "No," she said quickly. "No, of course not, but..." "Then we don't have a problem." David moved to the kitchen and began opening cabinets, revealing basic supplies that had been gathering dust for years. Canned soup, crackers, instant coffee, the remnants of a life he'd planned to live, but never quite managed to begin. "There's not much here, but it'll get you through tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out groceries." "We can't stay past tonight," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We need to keep moving." David paused in his inventory of the pantry. "Where to? I don't know yet. Somewhere far enough away that he can't find us. How far is far enough?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah's silence was answer enough. They both knew that in the age of social media and instant communication, there was nowhere far enough for someone truly determined to cause harm. Tommy stirred on the couch, mumbling something in his sleep about dinosaurs and trucks. Sarah immediately moved to his side, her hand gentle on his forehead, checking for fever out of habit born from nights in car seats and uncertainty about tomorrow's meals. "He's been having nightmares," she admitted quietly. "About him finding us. About what he might do if he does." David didn't ask who him was. The bruises on Sarah's wrists, the way she flinched at sudden sounds, the practiced escape they were clearly making, all painted a clear enough picture. He thought about his own nightmares, the ones where he arrived at the accident scene in time to save Jake, the ones where he woke up reaching for a son who would never reach back. "This place is hard to find if you don't know where to look," David said. "Millbrook's not on most maps, and the shop's at the end of a dead-end street. You'd have to be looking specifically to end up here." Sarah glanced toward the windows which faced the quiet residential street behind the shop, rather than the main road. "How long have you lived here?" "I don't live here. I have an apartment on the other side of town. This place was supposed to be for guests, but I never had many of those." David ran his hand along the back of a chair that hadn't been sat in for years. "My son used to come here sometimes when I worked late. He'd do his homework at that table while I finished up in the shop. Used to." Sarah's voice was careful, gentle. "He died 3 years ago. Car accident." The words came out easier than they had in months, perhaps, because sharing tragedy with someone who understood loss felt different than explaining it to people who meant well but couldn't truly comprehend. Sarah's expression shifted to something David recognized, the particular sympathy of someone who'd lost a child. "I'm so sorry. How old was he?" 8. His name was Jake. "I lost a daughter," Sarah said quietly. "Before Tommy. She was born too early, lived for 3 days. Her name was Emma." They stood in the gentle light of the apartment, two people who'd been broken by loss in different ways, understanding passing between them without need for explanation. David thought about the cosmic cruelty of parents burying children of love that continued beyond death, of the particular kind of emptiness that no well-meaning advice could fill. "That's why you're helping us," Sarah said, and it wasn't a question. Maybe David admitted. Or maybe it's just the right thing to do. Tommy woke, gradually blinking up at the unfamiliar ceiling with the confusion of a child who'd been moving too much to establish any sense of home. When he saw his mother and David talking quietly nearby, his face relaxed into something approaching security. "Mom." His voice was sleepy and small. "We're safe, baby," Sarah said, moving to sit beside him on the couch. "This is Mr. David's place. He's letting us stay here tonight." Tommy looked around the apartment with 6-year-old curiosity, taking in the covered furniture and the way late evening light slanted through the windows. "It smells like the garage where we got our car fixed that time. That's because it's above Mr. David's shop," Sarah explained. "He fixes cars and motorcycles." "Could I see them sometime?" Tommy asked, directing the question to David, with the hopeful expression of a child who'd learned to expect disappointment, but hadn't quite stopped hoping. "If your mom says it's okay, sure." Sarah's smile was the first genuine one David had seen from her. "We'll see. First, we need to get you into some dry clothes and into bed." David made his excuses and headed toward the door, but Sarah's voice stopped him at the threshold. "David." When he turned, she was standing beside the couch where Tommy sat, surrounded by the worn teddy bear and a life's worth of uncertainty. "Thank you. For dinner, for this place, for treating us like we matter. I know you don't owe us anything, and I know this isn't your problem, but—" "You're not a problem," David said firmly. "Either of you." As he walked back through the shop toward his truck, David felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening of the tight control he'd kept over his emotions for 3 years. The shop felt different with people in the apartment above, less like a mausoleum and more like a place where life happened. He paused beside the motorcycle he'd been restoring, running his hand over chrome that Jake had helped him polish months before the accident. His son had been so proud to be included in the work, so eager to learn everything David could teach him about engines and tools and the satisfaction of fixing broken things. Tomorrow he thought maybe Tommy would like to see how a motorcycle engine worked. Maybe Sarah would let him teach the boy something simple, safe. Maybe they'd stay long enough for David to remember what it felt like to have someone to take care of. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and reflecting the streetlights like scattered coins. David drove home through the quiet town, past the diner where they'd met, past the cemetery where Jake rested, past the empty house where he'd returned to sleep alone. But for the first time in 3 years, alone didn't feel quite so heavy. Somewhere across town, a little boy was sleeping in a warm bed instead of a car seat, and his mother was resting without fear for the first time in months. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was a beginning. David arrived at the shop earlier than usual the next morning, carrying a bag of groceries from Miller's Market and a nervous energy he hadn't felt in years. He'd spent most of the night lying awake, wondering if he'd made the right choice, if opening his life to strangers was healing, or just another way of avoiding the hard work of moving forward. But when he climbed the stairs to the apartment and heard the quiet sounds of a family morning routine, something settled in his chest. Sarah was in the kitchenette, trying to coax life from the ancient coffee maker, while Tommy sat at the small table coloring in a book that had seen better days. Both were wearing the same clothes from the night before, and David made a mental note to figure out the laundry situation. "Good morning," he said, setting the grocery bag on the counter. "I thought you might need a few things." Sarah's eyes widened as she peered into the bag. Bread, milk, eggs, cereal, fresh fruit, and the kind of basic necessities that most people took for granted. "David, you can't keep spending money on us." Consider it rent, he said, pulling out a carton of orange juice. Tenants are responsible for their own groceries. Tommy looked up from his colouring, his green eyes bright in the morning light streaming through the windows. Are we tenants? What do you think? David asked, sitting down across from him at the table. I think this place is nice, Tommy said seriously. It's warm and it doesn't move when trucks go by. The casual reference to sleeping in a car hit David harder than he'd expected. He thought about Jake's bedroom with its dinosaur wallpaper and toy chest full of treasures, the security of knowing that every night would end in the same safe place. What are you drawing? David asked, changing the subject. Tommy held up his colouring book, revealing a picture of a semi-truck that he'd coloured in meticulous detail. Every wheel was perfectly round, the cab was bright blue, and the trailer was decorated with flames that spiraled along the sides. That's incredible work, David said. And meant it. The boy had an artist's attention to detail and a 6-year-old's fearless use of colour. Have you ever seen a real engine, just from the outside? Mum says they're too dangerous to get close to. David glanced at Sarah, who was listening while attempting to wrestle breakfast from the limited supplies in the kitchen. They can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing. But if you're careful, and you listen to someone who does know, they're just machines that need understanding. Like people, Tommy asked, with the unconscious wisdom of childhood. Exactly like people. After breakfast, which consisted of scrambled eggs that Sarah managed to make taste like a feast, David offered to walk Tommy to the elementary school while Sarah stayed behind to organize their few belongings. The boy chattered constantly during the 4-block walk, asking questions about everything from the color of stop signs to why dogs bark at male men. Millbrook Elementary School was a brick building from the 1950s, surrounded by mature oak trees and the kind of playground equipment that had been built to last generations. Principal Morrison, a kind woman in her 50s who'd taught half the town to read, listened patiently as David explained the situation in carefully edited terms. We have space in Mrs. Patterson's first-grade class, she said, her eyes soft with understanding as she looked at Tommy. And we have a program for children who might need some extra support while they're adjusting. Tommy clung to Sarah's hand as they walked to his new classroom, but his curiosity overcame his fear when he saw the reading corner with its collection of books about trucks and dinosaurs. Mrs. Patterson, no relation to the diner's Dolores, was a teacher gifted with the ability to make every child feel like the most important person in the room. I have a feeling you're going to fit right in here, she told Tommy, showing him the desk that would be his and introducing him to the 2 boys who would be his table partners. David spent the rest of the morning in the shop, working on the motorcycle restoration with an energy he hadn't felt in months. The familiar rhythm of tools and concentration helped settle his mind, but he found himself listening for sounds from the apartment above, wondering how Sarah was adjusting to their first morning of safety in months. She appeared in the shop around noon, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, and her expression more rested than he'd seen it the night before. I hope it's okay that I came down, she said. I was going a little crazy up there with nothing to do. Of course. This is your home now for as long as you need it to be. The word home seemed to catch in her throat as if the concept was too foreign to accept immediately. She walked slowly around the shop, taking in the organized chaos of tools and parts, the workbench where projects in various stages of completion waited for attention. You do beautiful work, she said, running her hand along the gleaming tank of a restored Harley-Davidson. Jake would have loved this place. David looked up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. Jake. My ex-husband, Sarah said quietly. Tommy's father. He used to work on motorcycles before. She trailed off her hand unconsciously, moving to her ribs. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I want to, she said, surprising them both. I think I need to. She perched on a stool beside the workbench, her fingers worrying at the sleeve of her sweater. We were happy at first. He was funny and charming, and he made me feel like I was the most important thing in his world. But after Emma died, everything changed. He started drinking more, blaming me for what happened, getting angry about things that never bothered him before. David continued working while she talked. Understanding that movement made difficult conversations easier sometimes. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward, said he was sorry that it would never happen again, that he was just hurting so much about losing Emma. And I believed him because I wanted to believe him. But it did happen again. Many times. And when Tommy got old enough to understand what was happening, when he started flinching when Jake raised his voice, I knew I had to get us out. David set down his tools and looked at her directly. How long were you planning to leave? 2 years? It took me 2 years to save enough money for gas and food for a few days. He monitored everything, the bank account, my phone, where I went, but I had a friend at work who helped me hide cash little by little. Where does he think you are now? Sarah's expression darkened. He probably thinks I'm dead in a ditch somewhere, which might be preferable to what he'd do if he found us alive. The casual way she said it, the matter-of-fact acceptance of violence as a possible outcome, made David's hands clench around his wrench. He thought about Tommy's bright smile that morning, the way the boy had colored so carefully, and felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. When they picked Tommy up from school that afternoon, the boy was practically vibrating with excitement. He'd made friends with a classmate named Marcus, who shared his love of dinosaurs and misses. Patterson had read a book about construction vehicles that Tommy wanted to hear again. "Can we get that book?" he asked, as they walked back to the shop. "Marcus says the library has lots of books about trucks." "We can go to the library this weekend," David heard himself saying. "They have a whole section for kids." Sarah looked at him with surprise and gratitude, and David realized he was making plans for a future that included them. The thought should have terrified him, but instead, it felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in 3 years. October in Millbrook brought the kind of weather that postcards were made of, with maple trees exploding into shades of gold and crimson that transformed the small town into something approaching magic. David found himself looking forward to each day in a way he'd forgotten was possible, anticipating Tommy's stories from school and Sarah's gentle presence in the shop. Sarah had taken a job at Murphy's Diner, working the morning shift with Dolores, who'd hired her on the spot after learning she could manage the complex orders of truck drivers passing through on Route 34. The work wasn't glamorous, but it gave Sarah the independence she craved and the confidence that came from earning her own money. "She's good with people," Dolores told David one afternoon when he stopped by for coffee. "Remembers how everyone likes their eggs, never gets flustered when the lunch rush hits. And that boy of hers is welcome here any time after school." Tommy had indeed become a fixture at the diner, sitting in the back booth doing homework, while his mother worked charming the regular customers with his endless questions about their jobs and families. The elderly farmers who gathered for coffee each morning had adopted him as an unofficial grandson, teaching him card games and sharing stories about the days when Millbrook was nothing but farmland and dreams. Halloween approached like a holiday David had forgotten existed. For 3 years he'd ignored the costume displays in store windows and the excited chatter of children planning their trick-or-treat routes. But Tommy's enthusiasm was infectious, and David found himself genuinely caring about helping the boy choose the perfect costume. "I want to be a mechanic," Tommy announced over dinner one evening in the apartment. "Like you, David, with the blue shirt and the tools and everything." Sarah laughed, the sound lighter than David had ever heard it. "I think we can manage that." They spent the following Saturday afternoon at Millbrook's small downtown area, visiting the second-hand shop and the hardware store to assemble Tommy's costume. David found a child-sized work shirt at Murphy's 5 and Dime, while Sarah altered it to fit Tommy's small frame. From his own tool collection, David selected a small adjustable wrench and a screwdriver that Tommy could safely carry. "Now you look like a real mechanic." David said as Tommy admired himself in the apartment's mirror. The boy beamed with pride, adjusting his tool belt with the seriousness of someone preparing for important work. Halloween night brought trick-or-treaters to Millbrook's quiet neighborhoods, and David realized he hadn't bought candy in 3 years. Sarah rescued the situation with a quick trip to the grocery store, returning with enough chocolate bars and gummy bears to satisfy the costumed children who ventured down Oak Street. "Are you sure you don't mind staying here and handing out candy?" Sarah asked as they prepared to take Tommy on his rounds. "You could come with us." David considered the offer, imagining himself walking the familiar streets with a family that wasn't his, but felt increasingly important to him. The thought was both appealing and terrifying. "I'll hold down the fort here," he said, "but maybe next year." The phrase hung in the air between them, an acknowledgement that David was thinking in terms of future Halloweens, future celebrations, a future that included them. Tommy's excitement was boundless as they prepared to leave. He'd practiced his trick-or-treat and thank you until they were perfectly polite, and he'd studied David's tool belt until he could name every implement correctly. "I'm going to tell everyone I'm David's helper," Tommy announced, adjusting his costume one final time. The casual possessiveness in the statement, the way Tommy claimed a connection to David, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, made something warm spread through David's chest. They returned an hour later with Tommy's pillowcase half full of candy and stories about the neighbors who'd admired his costume. "Mrs. Chen said I looked exactly like a real mechanic," Tommy reported, showing David each piece of candy as if it were treasure. "And Mr. Peterson said you taught me well." David helped Tommy sort his candy into categories while Sarah made hot chocolate in the kitchen. The domestic normalcy of it, the way they moved around each other in the small space like they'd been doing it for years, felt both strange and perfectly natural. Later, after Tommy had fallen asleep with his tool belt still on and his candy carefully organized on the nightstand, David and Sarah sat in the shop's office, sharing a beer and talking about nothing in particular. "He adores you," Sarah said quietly, watching through the window as late trick-or-treaters made their way down the street. "The feeling's mutual," David admitted. "He's a special kid. He's never had a positive male figure in his life before. His father was either absent or angry, never the kind of man who'd spend a Saturday helping him build a costume or teaching him about engines. David thought about his own father, a mechanic who'd taught him that work was something to take pride in, that treating people fairly was more important than maximizing profit, that a man's worth was measured by how he treated those who couldn't help him in return. "Every kid deserves someone who believes in them," David said, "and every mother deserves someone who sees her child as more than a burden or an inconvenience." The weight of that statement settled between them. David understood that Sarah wasn't just talking about Tommy's relationship with his biological father, but about her own experiences with men who saw children as obstacles to overcome rather than blessings to cherish. "Tommy's not a burden," David said firmly. "Neither are you." Sarah looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You say that now, but you haven't seen him have a nightmare about his father finding us. You haven't had to hold him while he cries because he misses the home we had to leave behind, even though that home wasn't safe. Then I guess I'll learn how to do those things too." The promise was out before David could stop it, a commitment that went far beyond temporary shelter and meals. Sarah stared at him in the dim light of the office, her eyes bright with something that might have been tears or might have been hope. "David," she said softly, "I need you to understand something. We can't stay here forever. Eventually Jake will find us, or we'll have to move on for some other reason. I can't let Tommy get attached to you if you're going to disappear from his life. What if I don't want to disappear?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to examine fully. David thought about the empty years since Jake's death, the way he'd been going through the motions of living without actually participating in life. These weeks with Sarah and Tommy had awakened something in him he'd thought died with his son. I can't promise forever, David said carefully. Nobody can promise that. But I can promise that as long as you'll let me, I'll be here. For both of you. Sarah reached across the desk and took his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. That's all anyone can promise, isn't it? To be here as long as we can. Outside Halloween night was winding down, the last of the trick-or-treaters heading home with their treasures. Inside the shop, two adults who'd learned that life was fragile and precious were making promises they hoped they could keep building something that felt increasingly like family with every passing day. November arrived with the kind of cold that promised snow before Christmas, and the scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys throughout Millbrook. David found himself planning Thanksgiving dinner with an enthusiasm that surprised him, driven by Tommy's excitement about our first real holiday together, and Sarah's careful hope that they might actually have something to celebrate. I've never cooked a whole turkey, David admitted. As they stood in Miller's Market on the Saturday before Thanksgiving, studying the array of frozen birds like they contained state secrets. I have, but not for 3 years, Sarah replied, hefting a 14-pound turkey and checking the cooking instructions. My grandmother taught me before she passed, said any woman worth her salt should know how to feed people she loves. Tommy pressed his nose against the glass of the bakery case, his breath fogging the surface as he studied the array of pies. Can we get the one with the orange stuff? Sweet potato, Sarah said with a smile. And yes, we can get sweet potato pie. David watched them navigate the grocery store with the easy familiarity of a family. Tommy chattering about the cranberry sauce recipe his teacher had shared, and Sarah methodically checking items off a list she'd written on a napkin. He felt like an observer of his own life, amazed by how natural it felt to be planning a holiday meal for people he'd known for less than 2 months. What about your family? Sarah asked as they loaded groceries into David's truck. Do they live nearby? My parents died in a car accident when Jake was 5, David said. No siblings, no aunts or uncles. It's been just me for a while. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. Then we'll make our own family traditions. The week leading up to Thanksgiving was filled with preparation that felt more like anticipation than work. Tommy helped David set up the dining table that hadn't been used since before Jake died, carefully arranging the mismatched plates and silverware that David had accumulated over years of bachelor living. This is where you'll sit, Tommy announced, placing a napkin at the head of the table. And this is where Mom will sit. And this is my spot right here in the middle so I can talk to both of you. Sarah worked extra shifts at the diner, earning enough money to contribute to the grocery bill, despite David's protests. She also spent her evenings in the apartment's kitchen, practicing pie crusts and testing stuffing recipes with the determination of someone who wanted everything to be perfect. You don't have to prove anything, David told her on Wednesday evening as she pulled her 3rd attempt at cornbread from the oven. I want to, she said, checking the golden crust with the intensity of a scientist. This is Tommy's first real Thanksgiving, and I want him to remember it. David understood the weight behind her words. Tommy's early childhood had been marked by his father's drinking and anger holidays that ended in arguments and tears rather than gratitude and joy. This Thanksgiving would set a new pattern, a new standard for what family celebrations could be. Thursday morning dawned crisp and clear, with frost covering the windows of the apartment and the promise of snow in the afternoon forecast. David arrived at the shop early to find Sarah already in the kitchen, her hair pulled back in a ponytail and flour dusting her apron as she worked on homemade rolls. How long have you been up? He asked, accepting the cup of coffee she offered. Since 5. The turkey needs to go in the oven in an hour, and I wanted to get the side dishes prepped. Tommy appeared in the doorway, still in his dinosaur pajamas, but wide awake with excitement. Is it Thanksgiving yet? Can we eat the turkey now? Not for several more hours, Sarah laughed, wrapping him in a flour-dusted hug. but you can help us get everything ready." The morning passed in a blur of basting and stirring, with Tommy appointed as official taste tester for everything from mashed potatoes to green bean casserole. David found himself relegated to setting the table and opening cans, watching Sarah transform their modest kitchen into something approaching magical. "I want to show you something," David said during a lull in the cooking. He led Tommy down to the shop where he'd been working on a surprise project for the past week. In the corner, covered by an old sheet, sat a small workbench built specifically for Tommy's height. David pulled away the covering to reveal a perfect miniature version of his own workspace, complete with child-safe tools and a pegboard for organization. "Is this mine?" Tommy breathed, running his hands over the smooth wood surface. "If you want it. Every good mechanic needs his own workspace." Tommy threw his arms around David's waist with the fierce intensity of 6-year-old affection. "Thank you, thank you, thank you. Can I work on something right now?" "After dinner," David promised. "Today is for family time." The word family slipped out naturally, and David realized he'd stopped questioning whether that's what they were. They functioned like a family cared for each other, like a family made decisions with each other's welfare in mind, like a family. Whatever legal or biological definitions might say, this was his family now. Dinner was served at 4 o'clock, the apartment filled with the scents of roasted turkey and warm bread. Tommy said grace with the seriousness of someone performing an important duty, thanking God for his mom, for David, for their home, and for the best turkey in the whole world, even though we haven't eaten it yet. They ate slowly, savoring both the food and the conversation. Tommy regaled them with stories from school, including a detailed account of the Thanksgiving play where he'd been cast as a turkey and had forgotten his lines, but improvised a dance that brought down the house. "I want to go around the table and say what we're grateful for," Sarah said as they moved on to pie. "I'll start. I'm grateful for second chances for people who see the best in you when you can't see it yourself, and for having a place to call home." Tommy considered this seriously before speaking. "I'm grateful for David teaching me about engines, and for Mom not being scared anymore, and for having my own workbench, and for sweet potato pie." They both looked at David expectantly. He thought about Jake, about the Thanksgivings they'd shared, when it was just the two of them making the best of store-bought dinner rolls and overcooked turkey. He thought about the 3 years of empty holidays of avoiding the grocery store during November because the sight of turkey and stuffing made his chest ache. "I'm grateful for unexpected families," he said quietly, "for little boys who see magic in carburetors and brave mothers who protect their children no matter the cost. I'm grateful for Friday nights that don't feel empty anymore." After dinner, they walked to the cemetery, despite the light snow that had begun to fall. David wanted Tommy to meet Jake, wanted to share this day with the son who couldn't be there, but who had taught David everything he knew about love and loss and the courage to try again. Jake's headstone was simple granite with his name and dates, along with the inscription, "Beloved Son," that David had chosen because it seemed to capture everything essential about who Jake had been. Tommy approached the grave with the fearlessness of childhood, kneeling to brush snow from the stone. "Hi, Jake," he said conversationally. "I'm Tommy, and I live with your dad now. He's teaching me about motorcycles." Sarah stood beside David, her hand finding his as Tommy continued his one-sided conversation with complete sincerity. "Your dad makes really good pancakes, but he burns them sometimes. And he has the best tools in the whole world. I think you would have liked my workbench." David felt tears freezing on his cheeks as Tommy talked, sharing the details of his life with Jake, as if they were brothers separated only by circumstance rather than death. There was no sadness in the boy's voice, just the matter-of-fact acceptance of a child who understood that some people you love lived in different places. "Thank you, David," whispered to the headstone to Jake, to the universe that had taken his son, but somehow given him another chance at family. Thank you for showing me how to love again. December arrived with a vengeance, bringing the kind of winter that old-timers claimed hadn't been seen in Millbrook for 20 years. Snow fell steadily for 3 days straight, transforming the town into a Christmas card and effectively trapping everyone indoors with nothing but each other for company. For David, who had spent the last 3 winters avoiding holiday decorations and Christmas music, the forced intimacy of snow days revealed how completely his life had changed. Tommy treated the snow like a personal gift from the universe, pressing his face against every window in the apartment and begging to go outside every 10 minutes despite the sub-zero temperatures. David found himself building snowmen in the shop's parking lot, engaging in snowball fights that left him soaked and laughing and teaching Tommy to make snow angels with the patience of someone who'd forgotten how much joy could be found in simple pleasures. "You're different," Sarah observed one evening as they watched Tommy practice writing his name in the condensation on the apartment windows. They were trapped inside by another blizzard, the third that week, but the forced confinement felt cozy rather than claustrophobic. Different how David asked, though he knew what she meant. Lighter, like you've remembered how to be happy. David considered this as he watched Tommy create an elaborate story about the snow creatures they'd built, complete with detailed family relationships and careers. The boy had decided the snowman in the front was a mechanic like David, while the smaller one near the garage door was his apprentice learning the trade. "I think I'd forgotten that happiness was a choice," David said. "For 3 years I chose grief because it felt like the only way to honor Jake. But watching Tommy listening to him talk about everything like it's an adventure waiting to happen, I realized Jake would want me to choose joy." Christmas preparations began in earnest despite the weather, with Tommy creating increasingly elaborate wish lists that invariably included items for David and Sarah alongside his own desires. His generosity was unconscious and absolute, the natural inclination of a child who had learned that family meant thinking about each other first. David found himself shopping for Christmas presents with an enthusiasm he'd thought was permanently buried. He spent hours at Miller's toy store studying educational building sets and art supplies, consulting with Mrs. Miller about what 6-year-olds enjoyed and how to balance fun with learning. "You want something that'll grow with him?" Mrs. Miller advised, her eyes twinkling with the wisdom of someone who'd been advising parents and grandparents for 4 decades, something he can use now but won't outgrow in 6 months. David selected a deluxe set of building blocks designed for engineering projects, along with a beginner's toolbox filled with real but child-safe tools. For Sarah, he chose a locket that could hold 2 pictures, thinking she might want to carry photos of both her children close to her heart. Christmas Eve arrived with clear skies and temperatures cold enough to make breathing visible, the kind of night that made indoor gatherings feel sacred. David had strung lights around the apartment's windows, and Sarah had somehow managed to create a small Christmas tree using a potted pine from the nursery and decorations fashioned from paper and ribbon. Tommy had been vibrating with excitement for days, but on Christmas Eve he grew suddenly quiet and thoughtful. During their traditional Friday night dinner at Murphy's Diner, he played with his food instead of eating and answered questions with uncharacteristic brevity. "What's on your mind, buddy?" David asked as they walked back to the shop through streets illuminated by Christmas lights and fresh snow. "Will Santa be able to find me here?" Tommy asked quietly. "We moved so much this year, and we don't have our old address anymore." The question revealed the deep-seated anxiety that Tommy carried, despite his usually sunny disposition. The fear that good things were temporary, and that stability was an illusion. David knelt in the snow, bringing himself to Tommy's eye level. "Santa always knows where good kids are," David said with complete certainty. "And you know what? He's been talking to me. Making sure he has the right address for you." Tommy's eyes widened with hope and suspicion. "Really? You talked to Santa. Absolutely. He wanted to make sure you were settled and happy, and I told him you were the best kid in Millbrook. He's very impressed with your mechanical skills. The conversation continued as they climbed the stairs to the apartment, with Tommy extracting elaborate promises about Santa's knowledge of their new living situation, and David finding himself improvising explanations for how the North Pole Postal Service operated. He's never had a real Christmas, Sarah said quietly once. Tommy was asleep, his stocking hung carefully on the radiator since they lacked a fireplace. Jake always drank too much on Christmas Eve, and Christmas morning usually ended with him passed out on the couch, while Tommy played alone with whatever small gift I'd managed to hide away. David thought about his own Christmas mornings with Jake, the elaborate treasure hunts and pancake breakfasts, the way his son would wake him before dawn, with excitement that was infectious even at 5 in the morning. This year will be different, David promised. Christmas morning dawned crisp and bright, with Tommy waking the entire household at 6 a.m. with shouts of excitement about Santa's visit. David had stayed late the night before arranging presents under the small tree, transforming the modest apartment into something approaching magical. Tommy's joy was boundless and uncomplicated, approaching each gift with reverence before carefully unwrapping it and exclaiming over every detail. The building set and tools were examined with the intensity of an engineer studying blueprints, while a new set of art supplies prompted immediate plans for drawings he would create. But it was the gifts Tommy had made for David and Sarah that brought tears to adult eyes. For his mother, he'd created a coupon book offering services like 1 free hug when you're sad and help with dishes even when I don't want to. For David, he'd drawn a picture of the 3 of them working in the shop together with detailed labels identifying each tool and a banner across the top reading David's best helper. This is going on the office wall, David said, studying the careful crayon work with the appreciation usually reserved for museum pieces. The day passed in a blur of cooking and games, and the kind of easy contentment that made time feel both precious and eternal. They watched Christmas movies while snow fell outside, built elaborate constructions with Tommy's new blocks, and shared a dinner that featured Sarah's first successful attempt at roast beef. As evening approached and Tommy began to wind down from the excitement of the day, David found himself sitting beside the Christmas tree with a contentment he'd thought was lost forever. Sarah was in the kitchen cleaning up, humming Christmas carols under her breath, while Tommy played quietly on the floor with his new tools. "This is the best Christmas ever," Tommy announced with the certainty of someone making an important declaration. "I think you're right," David agreed, and realized he meant it completely. Outside, Millbrook slept under a blanket of snow, peaceful and still. Inside the apartment above Hayes Auto Repair, a family that had been assembled from broken pieces was learning that love came in many forms, that healing happened gradually, and that sometimes the most perfect gifts were the ones you never knew you needed. January brought a cold snap that froze the pipes in half of Millbrook and sent everyone scurrying indoors except for the essential workers who kept the town functioning. David was grateful for the steady work that winter breakdowns brought to the shop, but he noticed Sarah's increased anxiety as the days grew shorter and the isolation more complete. It started with small things. Sarah would pause while washing dishes, her hands stilled in the soapy water as she stared out the kitchen window at nothing in particular. She'd check the locks on both the shop door and the apartment entrance multiple times each evening, her movements careful and deliberate. When Tommy asked why she was being so careful, she'd smile and say she was just making sure they stayed warm, but David recognized the signs of someone who'd learned to be constantly vigilant. "Bad dreams?" he asked one morning when he found her nursing coffee at 5 a.m., dark circles under her eyes, suggesting another sleepless night. "Just restless," she said, but the way she avoided his eyes told a different story. The first concrete sign of trouble came on a Tuesday afternoon when David was working late on a transmission rebuild. Tommy was at his small workbench carefully sorting screws by size, while chattering about his day at school, when Sarah burst through the shop door with an urgency that made both of them look up immediately. "There was a man at the diner today," she said without preamble, her face pale and her hands trembling slightly. "Asking questions about me and Tommy." David set down his wrench and gave her his full attention. What kind of questions? Whether anyone had seen a blonde woman with a 6-year-old boy. He said he was looking for his wife and son who'd gone missing from Kentucky. Described us perfectly. Tommy had stopped sorting screws, his young face clouded with confusion and the beginning of fear. David noticed how the boy unconsciously moved closer to his workbench, seeking the comfort of familiar territory. "Did he give a name?" David asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Jake Porter. Told Dolores he was driving through town, checking every diner and gas station between Lexington and Cleveland." Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Dolores didn't say anything about us, but he left his phone number and asked her to call if anyone matching our description showed up." David felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd hoped that Jake Porter would eventually give up his search, that the difficulties of tracking someone across state lines would discourage him. But men who beat their wives and terrorized their children rarely gave up easily, especially when their control was challenged. "What else did Dolores tell you?" David asked. "She said he seemed nice enough on the surface, charming even, but something about him made her uncomfortable. The way his smile never reached his eyes, how he kept looking around like he was memorizing details." David recognized the description. Abusers were often skilled at presenting themselves as reasonable, concerned family members to strangers, saving their violence for private moments when there were no witnesses to contradict their version of events. Tommy had been listening with the intense focus of a child, trying to understand adult conversations that directly affected his safety. "Is my dad looking for us?" he asked quietly. Sarah knelt beside his workbench, her hands gentle on his shoulders. "Maybe, sweetheart. But we're safe here with David, and we're going to make sure you stay safe. But what if he finds us?" Tommy's voice was small, and David could see the fear that he'd worked so hard to overcome creeping back into the boy's expression. "Then we'll deal with it," David said firmly. "All three of us together." That evening, David installed additional locks on both the shop door and the apartment entrance, along with a security system that would alert his phone if anyone entered the building after hours. He also had a frank conversation with Pastor Williams about keeping an eye out for strangers asking questions about Sarah and Tommy. "That family's been through enough," Pastor Williams said. When David explained the situation in carefully edited terms, "I'll put the word out to keep watch without making it obvious. Millbrook takes care of its own." The support was comforting, but David knew it wouldn't be enough if Jake Porter was truly determined to find them. Men like that had a way of being resourceful when it came to tracking down the people they considered their property. Sarah's anxiety increased exponentially over the following days. She jumped at unexpected sounds, checked and rechecked the locks, and started keeping a bag packed with essential items just in case. Tommy noticed his mother's fear and began exhibiting his own signs of stress, losing his appetite and having difficulty sleeping. "We should leave," Sarah said one evening as they sat in the apartment after Tommy had finally fallen asleep. "We've put you in danger just by being here, and if Jake finds us—" "You're not going anywhere," David interrupted. "This is your home now, and I'm not about to let some bully drive you away from the first place Tommy's felt safe. You don't understand what he's capable of." Sarah's voice was tight with remembered fear. "He put me in the hospital twice before I left. Once with 3 broken ribs, once with a concussion that left me dizzy for weeks. And that was when he was just angry. If he finds out another man has been taking care of his son—" David reached across the space between them and took her hand. "Then we make sure he doesn't find out. And if he does, we handle it. Together." The word "together" seemed to anchor something in Sarah, but David could see the war between hope and fear playing out in her expression. She'd learned to expect the worst from the men in her life, and trusting that David would be different required more faith than she'd been able to afford for years. 2 days later, the worst of David's fears materialized. He was closing up the shop around 7 p.m. when he noticed headlights pulling into the parking area. The car sat there for several minutes, engine running, before the driver finally got out and approached the shop door. Jake Porter was exactly what David had expected, and somehow worse than he'd imagined. Tall and broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical presence that took up more space than his actual size warranted. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his clothes expensive but casual, and his smile was the kind that charm worn like a mask. But his eyes were cold, calculating, and when they fixed on David through the shop window, they held the predatory focus of someone who enjoyed having power over others. David unlocked the door but didn't step aside to let Porter enter. "Help you with something?" David asked, his tone neutral. "I'm looking for my wife and son." "Porter," said his voice, carrying just the right note of concerned family man. "I think they might have passed through this area. Blonde woman, about 29, traveling with a 6-year-old boy. They've been missing for months and I'm worried sick about them." The performance was polished, complete with a slight tremor in his voice that might have convinced someone who didn't know better. But David had seen the bruises on Sarah's wrists, had held Tommy during nightmares about angry fathers, and he wasn't buying a word of it. "Haven't seen anyone like that?" David lied smoothly. "But if I do, you got a card or something?" Porter handed over a business card with his contact information, his eyes already scanning the shop behind David, looking for signs of Sarah and Tommy's presence. "I appreciate any help you can give me." "Porter," said his smile widening. "They're all I have in the world and I just want them home safe." The way he said home made David's skin crawl. It was the possessive tone of someone who viewed his family as property rather than people with their own agency and right to safety. "Sure thing," David said, pocketing the card. "I'll keep an eye out." Porter lingered for another moment, clearly hoping to be invited inside or to catch a glimpse of something that would confirm his suspicions. When it became clear that David wasn't going to be more accommodating, he finally returned to his car and drove away. David locked the shop door behind him and immediately climbed the stairs to the apartment where he found Sarah and Tommy reading together on the couch. The domestic scene was so peaceful, so perfect in its ordinary happiness, that David felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. "He's here," David said quietly, not wanting to alarm Tommy unnecessarily, but knowing Sarah needed to be prepared. Sarah's face went white, but she didn't panic. Instead, she carefully marked their place in the book and suggested Tommy start getting ready for bed, her voice steady, despite the fear David could see in her eyes. After Tommy was safely tucked in and had fallen asleep, David told Sarah about the encounter in detail, including his assessment of Porter's demeanor and the clear intelligence behind his seemingly casual questions. "He knows we're here," Sarah said, with the flat certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "Maybe not for sure, but he suspects. That's why he came directly to you instead of just asking around town." David nodded grimly. "The question is, what's his next move?" They didn't have to wait long to find out. Jake Porter returned 3 days later this time, without the pretense of politeness. David was working under the hood of a pickup truck when he heard footsteps approaching across the shop floor, the sound deliberately heavy and aggressive. He slid out from under the vehicle to find Porter standing in the middle of the workspace, his expensive jacket incongruous among the oil stains and tool benches. "We need to talk," Porter said, his mask of concerned husband completely gone. What remained was something harder and more dangerous, a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation. David stood slowly wiping his hands on a rag while keeping his eyes fixed on Porter's face. "Shop's open to the public, but I'm busy. You need something specific, or are you just browsing?" "I know they're here," Porter said, his voice low, but carrying clearly in the enclosed space. "My wife and my son. I know you're hiding them, and I want them back." Don't know what you're talking about. David replied evenly, though his mind was racing through potential scenarios. The apartment was directly above them, and if Tommy was up there doing homework, he might hear voices through the floor. Porter took a step closer, his physical presence designed to intimidate. Look, I get it. Pretty blonde shows up with a sob story about her mean husband, bats her eyes, and suddenly you're feeling like a hero. But you don't know the whole story. Sarah's got problems, mental health issues, and she took my son away from his home, his school, his life. The practiced speech was delivered with just enough sincerity to make it believable, and David recognized the skill with which Porter wove truth and lies together. Abusers were often masters of manipulation, capable of making their victims sound unstable while positioning themselves as the reasonable party seeking help. Even if that were true, David said carefully, it wouldn't be any of my business. It becomes your business when you're harboring a fugitive. Porter's voice hardened. Sarah violated a custody agreement when she left Kentucky with my son. I have legal documents that give me the right to take him back. David doubted the legal documents existed in any meaningful form, but he also knew that Porter probably had enough connections to make life very difficult for Sarah if he chose to pursue formal channels. Seems like a matter for the police then, David said. I'm sure they'd be happy to help you sort out your legal situation. Porter's laugh was harsh and humorless. The police in a small town like this? They're going to side with the local mechanic over an outsider. But I've got other resources, friend. People who can make your life very complicated if you don't cooperate. The threat was delivered with casual confidence, and David realized he was dealing with someone who was accustomed to using both legal and extra-legal pressure to get what he wanted. The expensive clothes and practiced manner suggested connections that went beyond simple domestic abuse. Are you threatening me? David asked, his voice remaining calm despite the anger building in his chest. I'm explaining reality, Porter said, moving closer until he was within arm's reach. Sarah's my wife. Tommy's my son. They belong with me and I'm taking them home. You can make this easy, or you can make it hard. But either way, it's happening. David saw the punch coming a split second before it landed Porter's right hand, moving in a practiced arc toward his face. David managed to turn slightly, taking the blow on his cheek rather than his nose, but the impact still sent him staggering backward into the pickup truck. Nothing personal, Porter said, flexing his fingers as if the punch had been a casual gesture. But you needed to understand how serious I am about this. David touched his cheek, feeling the heat that would soon become a bruise, and made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He'd spent 3 years avoiding conflict, withdrawing from life, letting grief make him passive. But watching Porter's casual violence, knowing that Sarah and Tommy were upstairs, possibly listening to this conversation, he felt something wake up inside him that he'd thought died with Jake. Your turn's over, David said quietly, pushing himself away from the truck. Porter was bigger and probably stronger, but David had spent 20 years doing physical labor, and his reflexes were sharpened by years of working with dangerous machinery. When Porter swung again, David was ready. He caught the bigger man's arm, used his momentum against him, and drove him backward into the workbench with enough force to send tools clattering to the floor. The fight that followed was brief, but vicious. Porter fought with the calculated aggression of someone who was used to intimidating opponents with size and sudden violence. David fought with the desperate intensity of someone protecting his family. Every blow motivated by thoughts of Tommy's nightmares and Sarah's trembling hands. When it was over, Porter was on the floor with a bloody nose, and David was standing over him with scraped knuckles and a split lip that would match his bruised cheek. Get up and get out, David said, his voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Porter struggled to his feet, his expensive jacket torn and his perfect hair disheveled. But instead of looking defeated, he seemed almost pleased, as if David's resistance had confirmed something he'd been hoping to prove. "This isn't over," Porter said, wiping blood from his nose with the back of his hand. "You just made this a lot more complicated than it needed to be." "Yeah, well, complicated's what I do for a living," David replied. After Porter left, David locked the shop door and climbed the stairs to the apartment, where he found Sarah standing at the window with Tommy pressed against her side. Both of them looked pale and frightened, and David realized they'd heard everything. "He hit you," Tommy said, his young voice tight with concern as he stared at David's bruised face. "I'm okay, buddy," David said, kneeling down to Tommy's level. "And I'm not going to let anything happen to you or your mom." But even as he made the promise, David wondered if he'd be able to keep it. Porter had the confidence of someone who was used to getting what he wanted, and his parting words suggested that direct confrontation was just the beginning of his campaign to reclaim what he considered his property. "We have to leave," Sarah said that evening after Tommy was asleep, her voice heavy with resignation. "He's not going to stop, and I won't let him hurt you because of us." "You're not leaving," David said firmly. "This is your home. Tommy's school is here, your job is here, your life is here. We're not going to let him drive you away from the first place you felt safe." Sarah looked at him with an expression that mingled gratitude with despair. "David, you don't understand what you're up against. Jake has money connections, and he doesn't care who gets hurt as long as he gets what he wants. He'll find ways to make your life miserable until you give up and tell him where we are. Then we'll make sure he doesn't get the chance," David said. He spent the next morning making phone calls, first to Pastor Williams, asking him to coordinate informal neighborhood watch efforts, then to Dolores at the diner, making sure she understood that Jake Porter wasn't a concerned father, but a dangerous man who posed a threat to Sarah and Tommy. Finally to Maria Santos, a family law attorney in the county seat who specialized in domestic violence cases. "Legally, your position is complicated," Maria explained during their phone consultation. "If there's no formal custody agreement and no record of domestic abuse, it becomes he said, she said. But if we can document his threatening behavior, establish a pattern of harassment, we might be able to get a restraining order. What about the jurisdiction issue? He's claiming she violated Kentucky law by bringing Tommy across state lines. That's more complicated. If he files the right paperwork in Kentucky, he could potentially get local authorities to cooperate with extradition proceedings. But that takes time and documentation that he might not have." David hung up, feeling like they were building a legal wall with tissue paper, but at least they were building something. The next phase of Porter's campaign began that evening with a visit from the Millbrook Police Department. Officer Patricia Chen, Mrs. Chen's daughter-in-law and one of only 3 full-time officers in town, arrived at the shop with the careful neutrality of someone who didn't want to be there but had official duties to perform. "I've got a complaint about a disturbance here yesterday," she said, her tone professional but not unsympathetic. "Man named Jake Porter says you assaulted him when he came looking for his missing wife and child." David invited her into the shop, where the evidence of their fight was still visible in the scattered tools and overturned equipment. "He swung first," David said simply. "I just finished it." Officer Chen nodded, making notes in her report. "That's what I figured when I saw his face. Man's got 2 black eyes and a nose that's definitely been rearranged, but he's threatening to file formal charges if his wife and son aren't returned to him." Officer Chen, David said carefully, "I want you to understand something. Sarah Mitchell and her son Tommy are residents of Millbrook now. They live here, work here, go to school here. Jake Porter is an abusive ex-husband who's stalking them across state lines. I figured that much out myself," Officer Chen said dryly. "Man's story doesn't add up, and I've seen enough domestic violence cases to recognize the signs. But my hands are tied if he files the right paperwork through proper channels." She paused, looking around the shop with the expression of someone making a decision that might not be strictly by the book. Unofficially, she continued, "I'd suggest you document everything, every conversation, every threat, every time he shows up uninvited. And if he puts a hand on anyone in this family, you call me immediately." After she left, David realized that Porter's strategy was becoming clear. Unable to simply take Sarah and Tommy by force, he was going to use legal pressure and community harassment to make their lives so difficult that they'd eventually have no choice but to leave Millbrook. It was a patient, methodical approach that suggested Porter was more dangerous than David had initially realized. Men who relied solely on physical violence were often easier to deal with than men who combined violence with intelligence and planning. That night, as David sat in his own apartment across town, staring at the ceiling and nursing his bruised ribs, he understood that everything was about to get much worse before it got better. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in February, delivered by a sheriff's deputy from the county courthouse, with the ceremonial gravity that official documents demanded. David was having coffee with Sarah and Tommy before school when the knock came, and he saw Sarah's face go pale the moment she heard the formal voice identifying the visitor. Court papers for Sarah Mitchell regarding custody proceedings initiated in Jefferson County, Kentucky. The deputy announced, handing over an envelope thick with legal documents. Sarah's hands shook as she opened the envelope and began reading. Tommy continued eating his cereal, but David could see the boy's attention focused on his mother's increasingly distressed expression. "He's filed for emergency custody," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Claims I kidnapped Tommy and took him across state lines without permission. He's requesting immediate return of the child and formal charges for custodial interference." David took the papers and scanned the legal language, recognizing enough terms to understand that Porter had indeed found a way to use the court system as a weapon. The documents made Sarah sound like an unstable woman who had irrationally fled with her child, while Porter was presented as a concerned father, seeking the return of his son through proper legal channels. "Mum, what's wrong?" Tommy asked, his young face creased with worry. "Nothing you need to worry about right now, sweetheart," Sarah said, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just some boring, grown-up paperwork." After Tommy left for school, Sarah collapsed onto the couch as if the legal documents had physically drained her strength. "He's going to win," she said flatly. "I don't have the money for the kind of lawyer it would take to fight this, and he's made everything sound like I'm the problem. Look at this." She pointed to a section of the filing that described Porter as a successful business owner and concerned father, while characterizing Sarah's departure from Kentucky as an irrational decision made without consideration for the child's welfare or established custody arrangements. "What custody arrangements?" David asked. "You told me you were never divorced, never had any formal agreements." "We didn't, but he's claiming we had a verbal agreement about sharing custody and that I violated it when I left the state. He's got witnesses who will swear we discussed it." David recognized the strategy. Porter was using his connections and resources to create a legal fiction that would be difficult to disprove, especially since Sarah couldn't afford the kind of legal representation that would be necessary to challenge his claims effectively. "We're not giving up," David said firmly. "Maria Santos said she'd handle the case pro bono if necessary, and we've got our own witnesses." The next few weeks were a blur of legal consultations, document preparation, and community rallying that surprised David with its intensity. Pastor Williams organized a letter-writing campaign with members of his congregation providing character references for Sarah. Dolores and the other diner employees testified to Sarah's work ethic and stability. Tommy's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, wrote a detailed report about his academic progress and emotional development since enrolling in Millbrook Elementary. Most importantly, Officer Chen documented every instance of Porter's harassment, creating an official record of behavior that contradicted his claims of being a reasonable father seeking reunion with his son. "The problem is jurisdiction," Maria Santos explained during one of their strategy sessions. Kentucky has a legitimate interest in enforcing its custody laws, and Ohio courts are generally required to cooperate with properly filed requests from other states. But what about the domestic abuse? David asked. Doesn't that change things? It would if we could prove it. But hospital records from years ago aren't conclusive, and Sarah's word alone isn't enough to overcome Porter's documentation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Chen, who had been quietly conducting her own investigation through her network of Korean-American business owners throughout the Midwest, discovered that Porter's successful business was actually under investigation by Kentucky state authorities for money laundering and fraud. My cousin's husband works for the state attorney's office in Frankfurt. Mrs. Chen told David over coffee at the diner. He says Porter's construction company has been winning contracts through bribery and using the projects to clean money for some very unsavory people. The information changed everything. Maria Santos was able to argue that returning Tommy to Kentucky would place him in an environment where his father was likely to face criminal prosecution, making Kentucky an unstable and potentially dangerous situation for a child. More importantly, the investigation explained Porter's determination to retrieve his family. A man facing potential criminal charges would want to appear as stable and family-oriented as possible, and having his wife and child testify to his character would be invaluable to his defense strategy. He's not just trying to get Tommy back because he misses him, Sarah realized during one of their legal conferences. He needs us to make him look sympathetic to a jury. The custody hearing was scheduled for a cold morning in March, held in the county courthouse 30 miles from Millbrook. Sarah had barely slept the night before, and Tommy sensed the tension despite everyone's efforts to shield him from the legal drama. "Are they going to make me go back to Kentucky?" Tommy asked David as they prepared to leave for the courthouse. David knelt down to the boy's level, choosing his words carefully. "We're going to do everything we can to make sure you stay here with your mom, where you're safe and happy. But what if they don't listen? Then we'll keep fighting until they do." The courtroom was smaller than David had expected, paneled in dark wood, and filled with the kind of formal atmosphere that made ordinary people feel small and intimidated. Porter sat at one table with his attorney, an expensive-looking man in a perfect suit, who exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to winning. Sarah sat beside Maria Santos, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression carefully composed despite the fear David could see in her eyes. Tommy was called to testify, and David felt his heart break watching the 6-year-old walk to the witness stand with the serious demeanor of someone who understood that important decisions were being made about his life. The judge, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and grey hair, spoke to Tommy, gently asking about his life in Millbrook, his school, his friends, and how he felt about the idea of returning to Kentucky. "I don't want to go back," Tommy said clearly, his small voice carrying across the courtroom. "My dad there was angry all the time, and he hurt my mom. David teaches me about engines and doesn't yell, and my mom doesn't cry anymore." Porter's attorney tried to discredit Tommy's testimony by suggesting that a 6-year-old couldn't understand complex adult relationships, but the judge seemed unimpressed with the argument. Sarah's testimony was more difficult to watch. She described years of escalating abuse, the fear that had dominated her daily life, and the decision to flee when she realized that Tommy was beginning to exhibit signs of trauma. "I know taking my son across state lines without formal custody documents was legally problematic," Sarah said, her voice steady, despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "But I also know that staying would have eventually gotten one or both of us killed." Porter's attorney challenged her claims, pointing out the lack of police reports or medical records documenting abuse. But Maria Santos countered with Officer Chen's documentation of Porter's harassment in Millbrook, along with testimony from community members about Sarah's character and stability. The hearing that was supposed to last one day stretched into 2 as both sides presented their cases. Porter took the stand, and gave a polished performance, presenting himself as a grieving father who just wanted his family back. He denied any history of abuse, characterized Sarah's departure as the product of postpartum depression and poor judgment, and painted their life in Kentucky as stable and loving. But his performance cracked when Maria Santos began asking detailed questions about his business practices and the ongoing investigation by Kentucky authorities. Porter's attorney objected repeatedly, but the judge allowed the line of questioning as relevant to Tommy's potential living situation. "Is it true that your construction company is currently under investigation for fraud and money laundering?" Maria Santos asked. "Those are unfounded allegations from competitors trying to damage my reputation," Porter replied. But David could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool courtroom temperature. "Is it true that federal agents searched your offices and seized financial records relating to government contracts? My attorney has advised me not to comment on ongoing investigations." The admission was damaging enough, but Porter's carefully constructed facade suffered its final blow when Maria Santos presented documentation showing that he had indeed been formally charged with fraud just 2 weeks before filing for custody of Tommy. "So your position is that my client should return her son to Kentucky, where you're facing potential imprisonment for federal crimes?" Maria Santos asked. "Those charges are false and they'll be dismissed," Porter said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The judge deliberated for 3 hours before returning with her decision. David held Sarah's hand while they waited, feeling the tension radiating through her small frame as she prepared for the possibility that Tommy might be taken away, despite everything they'd done to prevent it. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony presented, the judge began, "This court finds that returning the minor child to Kentucky at this time would not be in his best interests." Sarah's sob of relief was audible throughout the courtroom, and David felt his own eyes fill with tears as the judge continued. "The court recognizes that Ms. Mitchell's departure from Kentucky may have been legally problematic, but given the evidence of domestic violence and the respondent's current legal difficulties, granting emergency custody would place the child at risk." Furthermore, the judge continued, "The child has clearly established roots in Ohio, including school enrollment, community connections, and emotional stability that would be disrupted by forced relocation." Porter's face went dark with rage as the judge awarded temporary custody to Sarah and established guidelines for any future contact between father and son. The victory was comprehensive and legally binding, but David could see in Porter's expression that this wasn't over. As they left the courthouse, Tommy ran to David and threw his arms around his waist with the fierce intensity of childhood relief. "We won, didn't we?" Tommy asked, his face bright with hope. "Yes, buddy," David said, lifting the boy into his arms. "We won." But even as he spoke the words, David was watching Jake Porter walk to his expensive car with the controlled movements of someone whose carefully constructed plans had just collapsed. Men like Porter didn't accept defeat gracefully, and David suspected that legal victory was just the beginning of a much more dangerous game. The attack came 3 weeks later on a night when the March wind was howling through Millbrook with the fury of winter's last stand. David was in his apartment across town grading estimates for a commercial repair job when his phone buzzed with a text from Tommy that sent ice through his veins. "He's here. Mom says hide and call you." David was in his truck and driving toward the shop before his conscious mind had fully processed what he'd read. The streets of Millbrook were empty at 11 p.m., most residents safely tucked into their homes, while the wind rattled windows and sent garbage cans tumbling down sidewalks. The shop's parking area appeared normal when David pulled in no strange vehicles or obvious signs of disturbance. But the lights in his apartment above were off when they should have been on, and something about the silence felt wrong, loaded with the kind of tension that preceded violence. David climbed the stairs to the apartment as quietly as he could, his heart hammering against his ribs as he listened for any sound that might indicate what was happening inside. The door was slightly ajar, something Sarah would never have allowed under normal circumstances. He pushed it open slowly and stepped into darkness that was broken only by the dim glow of a streetlight filtering through the windows. The apartment felt different, wrong, as if the very air had been disturbed by something malevolent. "Sarah," he called softly. A muffled sound from the bedroom made him move faster, abandoning caution for urgency. What he found in the doorway would haunt him for the rest of his life. Sarah was on the floor beside the bed, her hands zip-tied behind her back and duct tape covering her mouth. Her left eye was swollen shut, and blood from her split lip had stained her shirt. She was conscious, but clearly disoriented. Her good eye wide with terror as she tried to communicate something urgent. Jake Porter stood over Tommy's bed, one hand resting on the sleeping boy's shoulder, in a gesture that was both protective and threatening. In his other hand he held a knife that caught the dim light with malevolent purpose. "Close the door," Porter said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled calm of someone who had planned this moment carefully. "And don't even think about reaching for your phone." David complied, his mind racing through options that all seemed to end with either Sarah or Tommy getting hurt. Porter had clearly been planning this for weeks, waiting for the right moment to bypass all the legal proceedings and community support that had protected them in daylight. "This could have been easy." Porter continued, his grip tightening slightly on Tommy's shoulder. "I offered you money to stay out of this. I tried to handle it through proper channels, but you had to turn it into some kind of crusade." Tommy stirred under Porter's touch, mumbling something in his sleep about dinosaurs, and school blissfully unaware that his worst nightmare was standing beside his bed. "Let them go," David said, keeping his voice low to avoid waking Tommy. "Your fight is with me now." Porter smiled, and the expression was truly terrifying in its complete absence of warmth or humanity. "My fight was never with you. You're just collateral damage in a family matter that got out of hand." He gestured toward Sarah with the knife, and David saw her flinch despite her restraints. "Sarah knows what this is about. Don't you, sweetheart? This is about respect, about understanding that when you make a commitment to someone, you don't just run away when things get difficult." David saw Sarah try to speak through the tape, her sounds frantic and desperate. "She wants to tell you that she's sorry," Porter translated with mock sympathy. "Sorry for putting you in this situation. Sorry for making you think you could play house with my family. Sorry for not understanding that some things are permanent, whether you like them or not." Tommy's breathing changed slightly, the rhythm shifting as he began to wake up. Porter noticed immediately, his hand pressing down more firmly on the boy's shoulder. "Easy there, champ," Porter said softly. "Daddy's here now. Everything's going to be just fine." Tommy's eyes opened slowly, confusion giving way to recognition, and then to pure terror as he saw his father standing over him in the dark. "Mom," Tommy's voice was small and scared, and David saw Porter's jaw tighten at the boy's immediate concern for Sarah rather than relief at seeing him. "Mom's just resting," Porter said, his voice taking on the false gentleness that abusers often used when they wanted to appear reasonable. "We're all going to take a little trip together back home where we belong." "I don't want to go home," Tommy said, his voice growing stronger as he became fully awake. "I want to stay here with David." The statement hit Porter like a physical blow, his carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal the rage underneath. "You don't get to choose, Porter," snapped his mask, slipping completely. "I'm your father, and you'll do what I tell you to do." Tommy began to cry, the kind of deep, terrified sobs that came from a child who understood that the adults who were supposed to protect him were powerless to do so. David made his decision. Porter was focused on Tommy using the boy's fear to maintain control of the situation. But that same focus made him vulnerable. David had spent years working with dangerous machinery, learning to move quickly and precisely when circumstances demanded it. He lunged across the room, aiming not for Porter, but for the knife in his hand. The blade clattered to the floor as both men crashed into the nightstand, sending Tommy's dinosaur lamp tumbling to the carpet. The fight that followed was desperate and vicious, played out in the confined space of the bedroom, while Tommy screamed and Sarah struggled against her restraints. Porter fought like a man who had everything to lose, using his knowledge of the apartment's layout to his advantage. They rolled across the floor, each trying to gain position, while Tommy's cries grew more frantic and Sarah's muffled attempts to speak became increasingly urgent. David managed to land several solid blows, but Porter was younger and had the advantage of surprise and planning. The turning point came when Porter grabbed the fallen knife and slashed wildly, catching David across the ribs with a line of fire that made him gasp and momentarily lose focus. Porter used the opportunity to pin David against the wall, the knife now pressed against his throat. "This is what happens when you interfere with other people's families," Porter panted, his face flushed with exertion and rage. "You should have minded your own business." But Porter had made a crucial mistake in his moment of triumph. He'd turned his back on Tommy, forgetting that 6-year-olds could be surprisingly resourceful when people they loved were in danger. Tommy had slipped out of bed and retrieved something from his backpack, something small but solid. The wrench David had given him for his tool belt, the one he carried everywhere as a symbol of their shared work in the shop. The boy brought it down on the back of Porter's knee with all the force his small arms could muster, and Porter's scream of pain and surprise filled the apartment as he collapsed sideways, the knife spinning away across the floor. David didn't waste the opportunity. He grabbed Porter and drove him backward through the bedroom doorway, using the momentum to slam him against the opposite wall hard enough to rattle the windows. When Porter tried to get up, David hit him once more, a precise blow that left the other man unconscious on the apartment floor. The aftermath was chaos. David freed Sarah from her restraints while Tommy clung to both of them, his small body shaking with trauma and adrenaline. Sarah's injuries were painful, but not life-threatening, though the psychological damage would take much longer to heal. Officer Chen arrived within minutes of David's call, followed shortly by an ambulance and enough backup to secure the scene. Porter was taken into custody on charges that would ensure he spent years in prison, while Sarah and Tommy were transported to the county hospital for evaluation and treatment. "You saved them," Officer Chen told David as they watched the ambulance disappear into the night. "If you hadn't gotten here when you did." David didn't want to think about what might have happened. Instead, he focused on the small miracle of Tommy's courage, a 6-year-old boy who had overcome his terror to protect the adults he loved. At the hospital, while Sarah was being treated for her injuries, Tommy sat beside David in the waiting room, still clutching his wrench and occasionally touching David's bandaged ribs to make sure he was really okay. "Are we safe now?" Tommy asked, his voice still small and fragile. "Yes, buddy. We're safe. He's never going to hurt any of us again. Promise, I promise." Tommy nodded seriously, then curled up against David's side with the trust that only children possessed. "I was really scared, but I remembered what you said about tools, that they're for fixing things that are broken." David felt his throat tighten. "What was broken, Tommy?" "The bad man was hurting you and Mom, so I fixed it." As David held the brave little boy who had risked everything to protect his family, he understood that healing came in many forms. Sometimes it was gradual, like learning to love again after loss. Sometimes it was violent and terrible, like fighting for the right to protect the people you cared about. But always it required courage. The courage to act when action was needed to love, when love was dangerous to build something new from the broken pieces of what came before. Outside the hospital windows, dawn was beginning to break over Mill Brook, painting the sky in shades of hope and promise. Inside a family that had been forged in crisis and sealed in violence was learning that sometimes the strongest bonds were the ones created not by blood or law, but by the willingness to fight for each other when everything else failed. The darkest hour had passed, but more importantly, they had passed through it together. The courtroom was packed the morning Jake Porter's sentencing hearing convened 6 weeks after the violent confrontation that had nearly destroyed everything David and Sarah had built together. Representatives from Millbrook's tight-knit community filled the gallery, including Pastor Williams, Mrs. Chen Dolores from the diner, and even Tommy's teacher, Mrs. Patterson. They had come not just to witness justice being served, but to show their support for a family that had become emblematic of resilience and second chances. Sarah sat between David and Maria Santos at the prosecutor's table, her left hand resting in David's, while her right held a folder containing the victim impact statement she would read to the court. The bruises from Porter's attack had faded, but David could still see the psychological scars in the way she startled at sudden movements and checked doorways before entering rooms. Tommy was not in the courtroom. At 6 years old, he'd been through enough trauma without witnessing the formal proceedings that would determine his father's fate. Instead, he was spending the day with Mrs. Chen, helping her organize inventory at her grocery store and learning to count in both English and Korean. Jake Porter sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, flanked by his court-appointed attorney and 2 bailiffs. The expensive clothes and practiced charm were gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed look of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed completely. Federal charges related to his construction business had been filed separately, ensuring that even if he somehow minimized his sentence for the domestic violence charges, he would face years in prison. Your Honor. The prosecutor began the defendant's crimes represent a pattern of escalating violence and intimidation that spans multiple states and endangered the life of a child. This was not a crime of passion, but a calculated campaign of terror designed to maintain control over victims who had found the courage to escape. The evidence was overwhelming. Porter's midnight break-in had been recorded by the security cameras David had installed, providing clear documentation of premeditated assault and kidnapping. The knife recovered from the apartment bore Porter's fingerprints, and his injuries from the fight showed the defensive nature of David's actions. More damaging still was the testimony from 3 other women who had come forward after Porter's arrest, each describing similar patterns of abuse and stalking when they had tried to leave relationships with him. What had seemed like an isolated domestic dispute was revealed to be part of a much larger pattern of predatory behavior. Mr. Porter's actions demonstrate a complete disregard for the law, for the safety of others, and for the welfare of his own child. The prosecutor continued. He crossed state lines to stalk and terrorize his ex-wife, broke into a residence with the intent to commit kidnapping, and held a 6-year-old child at knife point. These are not the actions of a man seeking reconciliation with his family. These are the actions of a dangerous predator who views other human beings as property to be controlled. When Sarah stood to read her victim impact statement, the courtroom fell completely silent. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of years of suppressed fear and trauma. Your Honor, for 3 years I lived in constant fear of the man sitting at that table. I altered every aspect of my behavior to avoid triggering his anger. I made myself smaller, quieter, more invisible, hoping that if I could just be perfect enough, he might stop hurting me. She paused, glancing at David, who nodded encouragingly. But the night he broke into our home in Millbrook, I realized that my fear was never really about me. It was about my son who had found safety and stability for the first time in his life. It was about David who had shown us what kindness looked like and didn't deserve to suffer for his generosity. It was about the community that had welcomed us and the future we were trying to build. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. Jake Porter stole 3 years of my life through fear and intimidation. He stole my son's sense of security and trust in the adults who were supposed to protect him. But he will not steal our future. We have found a home in Millbrook surrounded by people who see us as more than victims. We have found love that doesn't come with conditions or violence. And we have found the courage to speak truth to power." She looked directly at Porter for the first time since the hearing began. "I am not your property. My son is not your property. We are human beings with the right to live without fear, and your actions will no longer define our lives." When the judge pronounced sentence 15 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for the first 10, the courtroom erupted in quiet applause. Porter showed no emotion, staring straight ahead, as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. Outside the courthouse, the Millbrook contingent gathered around David and Sarah like a protective shield. Dolores pressed a thermos of coffee into Sarah's hands, while Pastor Williams offered prayers of thanksgiving for justice served. Mrs. Chen, practical as always, announced that she'd already started dinner for everyone at her house. "It's over," Sarah said quietly to David, as they stood on the courthouse steps, watching Porter being led away in shackles. "The legal part is over," David agreed. "But the healing part is just beginning." That evening, as they sat in the apartment above the shop eating Mrs. Chen's homemade dumplings, Tommy asked the question that had been weighing on everyone's mind. "Is my dad going to jail forever?" Sarah looked at David, seeking guidance on how to explain complex adult concepts to a 6-year-old who had been through more trauma than any child should endure. For a very long time, David said carefully, "Long enough for you to grow up and become whatever you want to be without being afraid." Tommy considered this seriously, his small face creased with the kind of thoughtful expression that made him seem older than his years. "Good," he said finally, "because I want to be a mechanic like you, and I can't learn about engines if I'm scared all the time." 2 weeks later, David made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and certainty. He was working in the shop when Maria Santos called with news that would change everything. "The state of Kentucky has agreed to expedite Sarah's divorce proceedings," Maria explained. "Given Porter's criminal conviction and incarceration, it should be finalized within 60 days. She'll have full custody of Tommy with no visitation requirements." After hanging up, David sat in his office, staring at the drawing Tommy had made of their family, the crayon figures smiling beneath a banner that read, "David's Best Helpers." The boy had drawn himself between David and Sarah, small hands reaching out to connect them all. That evening, David drove to the jewelry store in the county seat where he spent 2 hours examining engagement rings with the careful attention he usually reserved for engine specifications. He settled on a simple solitaire that caught the light without being ostentatious, something Sarah could wear while working at the diner without worry. The ring felt heavy in his pocket as he drove back to Millbrook, weighted with possibility and hope, and the terrifying vulnerability that came with offering your heart to someone who had every reason to guard their own carefully. But as he pulled into the shop's parking area and saw the lights glowing warmly in the apartment windows, David understood that some risks were worth taking. Some families were worth fighting for. And some love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle, including the fear of opening yourself to loss again. Tomorrow he would ask Sarah Mitchell to become Sarah Hayes. Tonight he would simply hold her and Tommy close, grateful for the ordinary miracle of a family that had chosen each other against all odds. Spring arrived in Millbrook with an explosion of dogwood blossoms and the kind of soft warmth that made everyone want to spend their days outdoors after the brutal winter. David had been carrying the engagement ring for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment that seemed to perpetually hover just out of reach. Every time he thought about proposing, Tommy would need help with homework, or Sarah would be exhausted from a double shift at the diner, or the practical considerations of daily life would intervene. The moment finally came on a Saturday morning in late April, when the three of them visited Jake's grave for their monthly remembrance ritual. Tommy had taken to bringing drawings for Jake, elaborate crayon masterpieces depicting their life at the shop, and school adventures that he was sure Jake would want to hear about. "I made you a picture of the motorcycle David's teaching me about," Tommy announced to the headstone, carefully placing his latest artwork against the granite marker. "It's a Harley-Davidson, and David says you would have loved to learn about motorcycles too when you got older." Sarah knelt beside Tommy, adding fresh flowers to the small vase they'd installed. "I brought you some of those daffodils you always liked," she said softly. "They're blooming all around the shop now." David stood slightly apart, watching this ritual that had evolved naturally over the months. Tommy spoke to Jake with the easy familiarity of a little brother, while Sarah addressed him with the maternal affection of someone who had learned to love a child she'd never met. There was no jealousy or competition with Jake's memory. Instead, they had expanded their family to include him. Jake, David said quietly, stepping closer to the grave. "I need to ask you something important." Tommy looked up with interest, while Sarah remained focused on arranging the flowers, not yet understanding what was happening. "I want to ask your mom to marry me," David continued, his voice steady, despite the emotion building in his chest. "And I want to ask Tommy if he'd like me to adopt him officially so we can all have the same last name." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with surprise and something that might have been hope. "But first I want to make sure that's okay with you," David said to the headstone. "I'm not trying to replace you or make anyone forget you. I just want to love them the way they deserve to be loved, the way you'd want them to be loved." David pulled the ring box from his pocket and knelt in the soft grass beside Sarah, his heart pounding against his ribs as he opened it to reveal the simple solitaire. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Tommy have given me a reason to believe in family again. You've shown me that love doesn't end when someone dies. It just makes room for more love. Will you marry me? Will you let us make this official?" Sarah's answer was immediate and tearful, her hands shaking as she nodded vigorously. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Tommy whooped with joy, throwing himself at both adults in a tangle of arms and laughter that knocked them all off balance in the soft spring grass. "Does this mean I can call you Dad for real?" Tommy asked, his face bright with excitement. "If you want to," David said, slipping the ring onto Sarah's finger with trembling hands. "I want to," Tommy declared. "I've been practicing in my head for weeks." The engagement was announced at Murphy's Diner the following Friday during their traditional family dinner, with Dolores serving as the first witness and immediately appointing herself as unofficial wedding coordinator. Within hours, the news had spread throughout Millbrook's interconnected network of neighbors and friends. "We'll have the reception here," Dolores declared, producing a notepad and beginning what would become an elaborate planning session. "Mrs. Chen can handle the flowers, Pastor Williams can officiate, and my sister Margaret can make the cake." "We were thinking something small," Sarah protested gently. "Honey, you saved our boy David from disappearing entirely into his grief," Dolores said firmly, "and you brought that sweet child into our community. This wedding is going to be a celebration whether you want it to be or not." The planning process became a community project that revealed the depth of affection Millbrook's residents felt for their adopted family. Mrs. Chen transformed her grocery store into a flower-arranging workshop, teaching Tommy to create boutonnieres while Sarah learned to make centerpieces. Pastor Williams spent hours with David discussing the spiritual significance of marriage after loss, helping him understand that loving Sarah didn't diminish his love for his first wife or for Jake. Tommy threw himself into wedding preparations with the enthusiasm of someone who finally understood that good things could be permanent. He appointed himself as ring-bearer, flower arranger, and general consultant on all matters related to making the day perfect. "We need music," Tommy announced one evening as they discussed final details. "Jake would want music at your wedding." David and Sarah exchanged glances, both thinking of the silence that had characterized so many important moments in their lives. "What kind of music do you think Jake would like?" Sarah asked gently. Tommy considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important questions. Happy music, the kind that makes you want to dance even when you don't know how. The wedding took place on a perfect Saturday morning in May, with the Methodist church decorated in the simple elegance that reflected Sarah's preference for meaningful over elaborate. The guest list included most of Millbrook's population, creating the kind of community celebration that small towns specialized in. Sarah walked down the aisle wearing a simple white dress that Mrs. Chen's daughter had altered to fit perfectly, carrying a bouquet of spring flowers that Tommy had helped select. Her face glowed with happiness that seemed to illuminate the entire church, and David felt his breath catch at the sight of her. Tommy preceded her down the aisle as ring-bearer, his steps careful and measured, as he carried the pillow that held both wedding rings and a small toy dinosaur for luck. He took his position beside David, with the solemn dignity of someone performing a crucial role. Pastor Williams had crafted a ceremony that acknowledged both loss and renewal, speaking about the courage required to love again after tragedy, and the grace that allowed broken people to become whole. Marriage, Pastor Williams said, is not just a legal contract or a romantic gesture. It is a promise to choose love daily, especially when that choice is difficult. It is a commitment to build something together that is stronger than what either person could create alone. When it came time for vows, David spoke directly to Sarah's heart. Sarah, you taught me that grief and joy can coexist, that honoring the past doesn't mean sacrificing the future. You showed me that love multiplies rather than divides, and that families can be chosen as well as born. I promise to love you and Tommy with everything I have to protect what we've built together, and to never let fear keep me from showing you how much you mean to me. Sarah's vows were delivered through tears of happiness. David, you saw me when I was invisible, heard me when I had no voice, and gave us shelter when we had nowhere else to turn. You loved my son before you loved me, and that's when I knew you were the man I'd been hoping existed somewhere in the world. I promise to build a life with you based on trust instead of fear, hope instead of despair, and the absolute certainty that we're stronger together than apart. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, the entire church erupted in applause that could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Tommy launched himself at both of them, wrapping his arms around their legs with the fierce joy of a child whose family was finally complete. The reception at Murphy's Diner was everything Dolores had promised and more. Tables overflowed with food contributed by every family in town, while Mrs. Chen's flower arrangements transformed the familiar space into something approaching magical. The jukebox played happy music that made people want to dance even when they didn't know how, just as Tommy had requested. David's first dance with his new wife was tentative and sweet. 2 people learning to move together while their community watched with the satisfaction of matchmakers, whose efforts had succeeded beyond their wildest hopes. Mrs. Hayes. David whispered against Sarah's ear as they swayed to music that seemed to play just for them. I like the sound of that, Sarah replied, her smile brighter than any light in the room. When Tommy cut in to dance with his new mother, and then with his new father, the sight of the 3 of them together on the dance floor reduced more than half the guests to happy tears. As the evening wound down and the community began to clean up with the efficient teamwork that characterized all Millbrook gatherings, David stood on the diner's front porch with his wife and son watching their neighbors restore order to the celebration. Are you happy? Sarah asked, leaning against his shoulder with the contentment of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. I'm complete, David said, wrapping his arms around both of them as spring night settled over the town that had given them everything they'd never dared to hope for. 1 year later, on a crisp Friday evening in October, the Hayes family returned to Murphy's Diner for their traditional weekly dinner. But this time, everything was different and exactly the same in the way that only the most important transformations could be. David sat in the same corner booth where his journey had begun, but now Sarah sat across from him and 8-year-old Tommy Hayes occupied the seat beside the window. Jake's red backpack still hung on its hook, but it was joined by Tommy's blue school bag and Sarah's small purse, creating a tableau that spoke of memory honored and life embraced. 3 plates tonight, Dolores announced with satisfaction as she approached their table, carrying the dinner that had become their Friday tradition. Pot roast and mashed potatoes all around, with extra gravy for the growing boy. Tommy had indeed grown over the past year, gaining both height and confidence in the secure environment they'd created together. His adoption had been finalized 6 months earlier in a ceremony that was both legally mundane and emotionally profound, with Tommy officially becoming Tommy Hayes in a courthouse filled with their extended community family. "Tell us about school," David said, as they began eating a ritual that had evolved to include detailed discussions of Tommy's daily adventures and academic achievements. "Mrs. Patterson says I'm reading at a 4th grade level," Tommy reported proudly. "And Marcus and I are building a volcano for the science fair that's going to be even bigger than the one you helped me with last year." Sarah smiled at the easy way Tommy referenced last year, as if their life together stretched back forever instead of just 2 years. Children had a remarkable ability to adapt to happiness, to accept love as their natural state once they felt truly safe. "What about your math test?" Sarah asked, cutting her pot roast with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to savor meals instead of rushing through them. "A+, Tommy said with satisfaction. "I used that trick you taught me, about breaking big problems into smaller ones." David watched his family navigate their dinner conversation with the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over months of Friday evenings in this booth. The easy back and forth, the shared jokes, the way Tommy's excitement could make both adults smile even when they were tired from long days at work. Hayes Auto Repair had thrived over the past year, with David's reputation for honest work and fair prices drawing customers from 3 counties. Sarah had been promoted to shift manager at the diner, her natural warmth and organizational skills making her invaluable to both Dolores and the regular customers, who had become like extended family. But more than professional success, they had built something that felt sustainable and real. A life based on daily choices to show up for each other, to communicate honestly, to face problems together, instead of retreating into individual fear and isolation. "I have an announcement," Tommy said, with the dramatic flair that he'd developed for sharing important information. "Next week is Bring Your Family to School Day, and I want to bring both of you." Sarah and David exchanged glances, both remembering previous school events where they'd felt like they were pretending to be a family, rather than simply being one. "Both of us?" David asked with mock surprise. "Are you sure you can handle having 2 parents at school? That's a lot of supervision." "I can handle it," Tommy declared with 8-year-old confidence. "Besides, I want everyone to meet my real dad and see how he teaches me about engines." The casual reference to David as his real dad made something warm spread through David's chest. Tommy had stopped drawing distinctions between biological and chosen family months ago, accepting David's presence in his life with the total commitment that children brought to relationships they trusted. After dinner, they drove through Millbrook's quiet streets toward home, past the elementary school where Tommy would graduate from 3rd grade in the spring, past the Methodist church, where they attended services most Sundays, past the cemetery, where they still visited Jake's grave monthly to share news and leave flowers. The house they'd bought in the spring sat on Elm Street, 3 blocks from the auto shop and 2 blocks from Tommy's school. It was a modest 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a backyard big enough for Tommy's elaborate construction projects and Sarah's vegetable garden. David had been nervous about leaving the apartment above the shop, worried that too much change too quickly might destabilize the fragile happiness they'd built. But Sarah had gently pointed out that families needed room to grow, and the apartment had always been intended as temporary sanctuary rather than permanent home. The house purchase had been a family decision, with Tommy weighing in on important matters like bedroom size and proximity to good climbing trees. His room was on the second floor, decorated with a careful balance of dinosaur posters and motorcycle magazines that reflected his evolving interests. "Homework first," Sarah announced as they entered the house, following the routine that had become as natural as breathing. Tommy groaned dramatically, but headed upstairs without real protest, understanding that consistency in expectations was actually a form of security rather than restriction. David and Sarah settled into their evening ritual of planning the next day's activities, while sharing the comfortable silence of people who didn't need constant conversation to feel connected. "Chen stopped by the diner today," Sarah said as she sorted through the mail. "She wanted to know if we're planning anything special for the anniversary." The anniversary. 2 years since that rainy October night when Sarah and Tommy had stumbled into Murphy's diner and changed David's life forever. It seemed both like yesterday and like a lifetime ago. "What did you tell her that we hadn't discussed it?" "But she's already planning something, I can tell. You know how she gets when she thinks the community needs to celebrate?" David chuckled, imagining Mrs. Chen organizing another of her elaborate gatherings that somehow managed to involve the entire town while maintaining the fiction that they were simple, informal affairs. "Maybe we should beat her to it," David suggested. "Plan something ourselves before she takes over completely." They were interrupted by Tommy's voice calling from upstairs. "Dad, can you help me with this math problem? I'm stuck on the word part." David headed upstairs, his heart still catching slightly every time Tommy called him Dad with such natural ease. The boy's bedroom was organized chaos homework spread across his desk, while model airplanes hung from the ceiling and books about dinosaurs lined the shelves. "What's the problem?" David asked, settling into the small chair beside Tommy's desk. "This one about the train traveling between cities. I can't figure out what they're really asking." David studied the problem, recognizing one of those word puzzles that required breaking complex information into manageable pieces. "Remember what we talked about with engine problems," David said. "When something seems too complicated. What do we do first?" "Break it down into parts we understand," Tommy recited, then applied the principle to his homework with the methodical approach that David had taught him in the shop. 20 minutes later, the math problem was solved and Tommy was ready for bed. As David tucked him in, the boy asked the question that had become part of their nightly routine. "Tell me about Jake?" David settled into the chair beside Tommy's bed, the same chair where he'd told countless bedtime stories over the past 2 years. Jake would have been 11 now. David began painting a picture of the boy who had loved baseball and dinosaur books and Friday night dinners at Murphy's Diner. He would have been excited about your science fair volcano, and he probably would have wanted to help you build it even bigger. "Do you think he would have liked me?" Tommy asked with the vulnerability that sometimes surfaced despite his general confidence. "I think he would have loved you," David said with complete certainty. "I think he would have been proud to have you as a brother." Tommy nodded seriously, then smiled with the contentment of a child whose world felt safe and predictable. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, buddy." Downstairs, David found Sarah curled up on the living room couch reading a book about small business management that she'd been studying in preparation for possibly opening her own restaurant someday. "Everything okay up there?" she asked, making room for him on the couch. "Perfect," David said, settling beside his wife with the satisfaction of a man whose life had exceeded every dream he'd ever dared to have. Outside, October wind rustled through the maple trees that lined Elm Street, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter to come. Inside, a family that had been assembled from broken pieces sat together in their living room, planning tomorrow and remembering yesterday, grateful for the ordinary miracle of belonging to each other. In 2 years, they had traveled from desperation to security, from fear to trust, from survival to genuine happiness. The journey had been marked by challenges that tested their commitment and victories that strengthened their bond. But tonight, as David Hayes held his wife's hand and listened to his son's breathing settling into sleep upstairs, he understood that the most important transformation hadn't been external. It had been the gradual healing of hearts that had learned to love again, the quiet courage of people who had chosen hope over despair, family over isolation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys, but they would face them together, anchored by love that had been tested and proven strong enough to weather any storm. David Hayes stands in Murphy's Diner on a snow-dusted Friday evening in December, no longer the broken man who once sat alone with 2 plates of food growing cold. Sarah Hayes arranges fresh pine branches on their table, while 10-year-old Tommy Hayes hangs his Star Wars backpack next to Jake's faded red one, both boys forever part of their family story. They've kept Jake's memory alive, while building something beautiful and new, proving that love expands rather than replaces. The auto shop thrives with Sarah managing the business side and Tommy learning everything David can teach him about engine's integrity and the satisfaction of honest work. The community that once whispered about the unusual family now points to the Hayes as proof that families come in all forms, that love chooses its own definitions. Pastor Williams often uses their story in sermons about redemption, second chances, and the courage required to open your heart after loss. Mrs. Chen keeps their first family photo on her grocery store counter, telling anyone who'll listen about the night kindness changed 3 lives forever. As they bow their heads for Tommy's blessing over dinner, David catches sight of Jake's memorial photo on the windowsill, the boy grinning in his Little League uniform beside a newer picture of Tommy in his school baseball gear. 2 boys different but connected, both loved beyond measure. "Thank you, son," David whispers to Jake's image. "Thank you for teaching me that hearts can hold infinite love, that families can be chosen, and that every ending contains the seeds of a new beginning." In that sacred corner booth where desperation once brought them together, the Hayes family continues writing their story of hope, one Friday dinner at a time. If this story reminded you that broken doesn't mean beyond repair, that families come in all forms, and that love always finds a way to heal the deepest wounds, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that restore faith in humanity. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their story isn't over yet, that sometimes our darkest moments lead directly to our brightest chapters. What's one moment of unexpected kindness that changed your life? Tell us in the comments below, because your story matters too. We believe that every act of compassion creates ripples that can change the world one heart at a time.